and want to welcome everyone to the weekly meeting of the Rotary Club of Jonesboro, the not once, not twice, not thrice, but four-time reigning District 6150 Club of the Year. Want to call the meeting to order and welcome everybody. I am not Gary Higgins, nor do I play him on TV. Our inspirational moment before we get started is our attitude at the beginning of a difficult task, which more than anything else will affect its successful outcome. William James. Take it away, Neelam.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Jill. It's a huge honor for me today to welcome two very special guests to our program. One is the lovely Eileen McCormick-Place, who I've been liaising with. Very, very grateful to you, Eileen, for arranging this for us today. Also, it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Vincent Picard, who serves as the Senior Public Affairs Officer for the Department of State's Bureau of Counterterrorism, where he provides strategic communications direction for senior department leadership on international counterterrorism programs and policies. Mr. Picard is also the editor of the annual congressionally mandated County Reports on Terrorism, which is one of the State Department's premier annual reports. Previously, Mr. Picard served as a director for press on the National Security Council at the White House, where he oversaw public-facing campaigns on Western Hemisphere affairs and Homeland Security topics ranging from immigration policy and transportation security to global health and disaster response for the Executive Office of the President. Prior assignments include managing a national public affairs program at the Department of Homeland Security and also implementing public involvement programs for the U.S. Forest Office. A veteran of the U.S. Army, Mr. Picard resides in Arlington, Virginia, with his wife, Cindy, who teaches French and English at area middle schools. Mr. Picard is a very, very busy man, so we are very grateful to have him here today. Over to you, Mr. Picard.
Hi, thank you, Neelam, and appreciate that kind introduction. Whoever wrote that bio did a great job. So can you all hear me? Can I get a thumbs up? Just, I've had a little bit of lag on the sound. Awesome, thanks. So what I thought I would do today is just kind of give a brief overview of the State Department and the Bureau of Counterterrorism, and then touch on the threat landscape out there as we see it, and then open it up for questions. So I know I've sat in on a few Zoom things, and nothing is more exciting than a 40-minute speech, but I'm certainly going to try and keep it much shorter than that. So when we think about counterterrorism at the State Department, it's a functional bureau, what we call here. So the State Department, you know, we have offices all around the world, but here at headquarters in Washington, we're organized by regional bureaus and by functional bureaus. So regional bureaus will oversee policy for, say, South and Central Asia. Those guys are wrestling with what's going on in Afghanistan right now, or East Asia and Pacific. Secretary Blinken, our new Secretary of State, is currently traveling over there. So those folks have their hands full in doing all of the coordinating, messaging, and paperwork that goes along with having somebody of that status out on the road traveling. He's out there with the Secretary of Defense. So, so those regional bureaus kind of focus, as it says, on the region. And then we have functional bureaus, and that's counterterrorism is one of them. And those are issues that cross-cut across multiple regions. So every day working mostly with our folks in, say, the Near East and Africa Bureau that covers the Middle East and North Africa. SCA, which covers Afghanistan, but you also see, especially notice the domestic terrorism, sometimes that impinges here in the Western Hemisphere, mostly with our friends to the north when they do designation announcements or some activity, particularly by Hezbollah in the tri-border area of South America. So we cover those issues for the department, providing that policy input and implementing programs to advance the United States' interest in combating terrorism and building civilian capacity to establish the rule of law, which is really what the long-term strategy has to be when we think about how do we most effectively counter terrorism. So the CT Bureau has a number of different lines of effort, and they kind of break down along two lines. One of them is pure sort of short-term goals and programs that we do. Most notably, that would cover policy related to direct action, which is what the government calls killing people outside of military zones. So I think drone strikes and that sort of a thing. So we help guide and collaborate closely with the military on policies related to direct action and to the use of what we would call kinetic action to remove terrorists from the battlefield. We also work pretty heavily on things like countering terrorist financing. So that's ensuring that terrorist organizations and their supporters don't have access to financial institutions and can't access the resources that they need to plan and conduct terrorist attacks. It's an international effort that goes across pretty much every region to ensure that we're trying to keep our financial institutions clean of terrorist money moving through. Preventing terrorist travel is also key, right? So we want to keep terrorists where they are so they can't travel here, most importantly, but containing terrorist fighters is really an important strategy in limiting the spread of terrorist groups, terrorist cells. That's mainly a multinational effort. Of course, we work closely with the Department of Homeland Security and the TSA on internal, folks that are coming, what we would call last point of departure. So folks that are coming into the United States, but we seek to expand that safety net and that security net through the United Nations. There's a United Nations Security Council Resolution 2396 about terrorist travel that creates some sort of some mechanisms and obligations for partner countries to ensure that terrorists aren't using their territory to transit, to move to other locations, and also things like ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, which also implements standards more for the commercial industry, but also governments sign on to that to prevent them from traveling and also to strengthen soft target security. We also look at longer term things. That would be another line of effort. And that's where programs like countering violent extremism come in. So as we look, we want to remove terrorists from the battlefield. We want to prevent terrorists from being able to cross borders and to easily transit from one area to another. I think an easy example there is what happened with ISIS in 2015, where you had thousands, tens of thousands of, by some counts, of foreign terrorist fighters that were moving into Iraq and Syria in support of the Islamic State. That creates a real problem, and a problem that we're still dealing with, right? So I said that we want to prevent terrorist travel, but there are some terrorists we do want to travel, and those would be foreign terrorist fighters that are currently being held by the Syrian Democratic Forces in northeast Syria. There's about 2,000 foreign terrorist fighters there in detention camps, and about 10,000 associated family members that are in internally displaced camps, displacement camps in northeast Syria. And the United States strongly believes that countries should repatriate their foreign terrorist fighters, prosecute them as appropriate, and then especially with regards to the family members and the children, to rehabilitate and to reintegrate them into society as a long-term solution. Because the longer you have these folks in detention centers in northeast Syria, the greater the chance that there'll be a jailbreak, right? And now you're dealing with these guys that we now have in custody that'll be returned to the battlefield. And then for the family members, and particularly the kids, to stop indoctrination and exposure to terrorist ideologies that they're exposed to in these IDPs, which is short for internal displaced persons camps. We haven't had much luck with that in Western Europe, surprisingly. More success in South Central Asia. Countries like Kazakhstan have really led the way. Uzbekistan and the Kyrgyz Republic have also, Kyrgyz Republic just announced, I think today, or at least I saw it on Twitter today and retweeted a tweet from them about repatriating some kids from the IDP camps, something that we strongly encourage, and we work with our partners, partner countries that may not have the resources. A good example of that in Kazakhstan, we worked with Boys Town, which is the organization for kids that don't have family support in Oklahoma, to provide some subject matter expertise as Kazakhstan was setting up a rehabilitation center for family members who are returning from northeast Syria to help de-radicalize and reintegrate back into the society there. Okay. So that's stopping the money. We also have military collaboration, which I talked about. programs, capacity building programs. And what I mean by that is helping to establish the rule of law in a couple of different venues. One of them, the judicial venue, is probably the most important, and that goes from identifying, investigating, and arresting terrorists all the way up to ensuring that they're convicted and incarcerated properly. There's no really other way to address long-term drivers of terrorism without having strong rule of law, which is why we see when terrorist problems metastasize, they tend to occur in poorly governed areas because they seek to establish territory. And what's the easiest way to establish territory is where the existing government does not have control of the land or its borders, and where they can exploit existing ethnic conflicts, which is, we see that fairly common in Africa right now. And Africa is a real place of concern for the State Department and the United States as we look at a growing threat from ISIS there, and also from Al-Qaeda affiliated organizations. So I'll transition there and just make a general note that we're just coming out of a presidential transition, and so far what we can say is that the Biden-Harris administration has been clear-eyed about the terrorist threats facing the United States. Secretary Blinken has highlighted that in his public remarks and confirmation hearings at the Senate, talking about while we may have defeated the caliphate for ISIS, they still are out there, still seek to do us harm. And the same is true for Al-Qaeda. Coming up in September, we're going to be at the 20th anniversary of the September 11 attacks, which really completely reorganized, obviously with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, but even for organizations like the State Department that are focused outside of the domestic United States, completely reorganized government's approach to security, national security, and to protecting our infrastructure. Which I don't have to tell you that, I'm sure. But the thing I think I would want to stress there is that the situation is ever changing and it's fluid. And that fluidity is important to keep in mind when we look at the global terrorist landscape, because these groups have different ideologies, they have different goals, they have different objectives. But the one thing that they have in common, which is what makes them of interest to my bureau, the Counterterrorism Bureau, is the willingness to use violence to affect a political goal. Mostly that violence is directed towards civilians. We'd also, of course, see violence that's directed towards government infrastructure in countries that terrorist organizations operate. But it's that use of violence to advance a political goal that makes it terrorism, and it makes it of interest to us. So how do we kind of push back against that? Well, we confront a terrorist landscape that is more dynamic, it's complex, it moves fast. And despite the global pandemic, terrorist groups remain a persistent and pervasive threat to the United States and our people, our allies, and our partners as well. This hasn't been released yet, but we track the number of terrorist incidents from year to year. It goes into the country reports on terrorism, which is a report that was referenced earlier. Last year, we were somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,500 incidents worldwide. We don't count incidents in the United States, where the State Department, our authority starts at the water's edge. But we had about 8,500 recorded terrorist incidents in 2019, and we're going to be, I think, just over 10,000 for 2020. So despite the pandemic, we did see an increase in terrorist activity. I think a large part of that is due in places, we'll see the final results when my data analysts get the product to me, but I think where we're going to see that most clearly is in places like Africa, especially if you look at Mozambique. They're dealing with in their northern Cabo Delgado province, what transformed from a local sort of insurgency to a full-blown ISIS affiliate. And when I say full-blown, I mean fully adopting tactics and techniques that we've seen ISIS employ in other areas, for instance, beheading children, which is something that they've been doing recently, to inflict terror on communities, which has led to the displacement of almost 670,000 people in northern Mozambique, which is a real problem and something that we're focused on with some degree of urgency here at the State Department, also with the military. The Department of Defense this week announced a program for special forces to help train Mozambican defense forces, and hopefully that will have an impact and build their capacity to counter threats that are happening in their territories. transitioning over to ISIS. ISIS's network is active on multiple continents. Despite the complete liberation of its territory in Iraq and Syria. Last year, we saw a rise in ISIS attacks in Iraq and Syria. And so it's important, as Secretary Blinken has noted, that we not take the eye off the ball there. We have what we consider to be one of the most successful multinational efforts in United States history. That would be the 83 member global coalition to defeat ISIS that just did a heck of a job in destroying the so-called caliphate with the fall of Baghouz in 2019 in Iraq and in Syria. But they just scatter, hide out, and continue to and have been continuing to conduct attacks. And so it's important that we remain engaged with our partners in Iraq. Their security forces have really built up some capabilities and have been able to take the fight to the terrorists there, but they still need our support. We are committed to their enduring defeat of ISIS, and the coalition has joined us in that commitment. Taking into account that the spread of that to other continents, though, we're encouraging and trying to steer the coalition to focus on other places. We're starting off with Africa. We held a meeting in November with the coalition to focus on the Sahel, which is part of West Africa, and the Mali and Chad, that part of the littoral Sahel there. So I think if we can expand that scope, build on the successes and lessons learned that we had in defeating ISIS in Iraq and Syria, we can hopefully establish and help our partners in Africa establish some peace and security through the rule of law. So it's a long-term program, a long-term project. ISIS's branches and networks have increased the volume and lethality of their attacks abroad, particularly in Africa. At the same time, they continue to leverage their international appeal to attract others, including in the United States, and that causes them to conduct attacks and seek to conduct attacks here. We have very strong partnerships with our domestic agencies that focus on domestic terrorism in the United States, namely the FBI. They've done a really good job in identifying and defanging threats, homegrown threats, in addition to preventing folks who seek to travel overseas to support ISIS and other terrorist groups like them. It's a continuing concern, and you're a special agent for the FBI, not the call you want to get wrong, right? So they are very diligent and focused on countering those threats across the whole ideological spectrum, and not just on ISIS. And I'll get to that in a second here with what we call racially or ethnically motivated violence, which would cover sort of the white supremacist movement that we see in the United States and in Europe. In 2020, Al-Qaeda remains a resilient and enduring threat to the United States and its partners. According to my forthcoming report, the organization faced significant leadership losses last year with the deaths of senior Al-Qaeda leaders in Syria, guys like Qasem al-Rimi, the emir of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Abdel Malek Drukdel, who was the Islamic Maghreb and was really a guy causing a lot of problems in Libya. We helped the French with intelligence and surveillance, and they removed Drukdel from the battlefield last year, which is a significant victory. And Al-Qaeda's number two, who was a guy named Mohammed al-Masri, who found himself at the wrong end of the pointy stick in Iran last year. And no comment on how that came to be. And so what that means is that Al-Qaeda has more members and geographic range than it did before 9/11. They've really spread out and sought to sink their roots in. And to an extent, I would say that they took advantage of the focus on ISIS and the global coalition's focus on ISIS to spread, to grow. And we're dealing now with the consequences of that as Al-Qaeda's networks continue to exploit under. So I was talking about Al-Qaeda's membership and geographic range being wider than it ever has. Some examples of that, and some that you see quite frequently: Al-Shabaab in the Horn of Africa. You may recall last year the attack in Manda Bay that ended up in U.S. citizens being killed on a military installation in Kenya. There's JNIM, which is another Al-Qaeda affiliate operating in the Sahel that is one of the most active terrorist groups in the world. And there's another affiliate in Syria called Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham. We call it HTS, which is often, Syria is a very interesting place right now because there are a lot of different countries that have assets in play there, and there are a lot of different terrorist groups and front groups operating that kind of crisscross each other, and sometimes it can be difficult to tell exactly who is representing which interests. As you know, we have Iran there, and Russia, Syria, the United States. Turkey obviously has interests that sometimes are not perfectly aligned with the United States, which can cause some issues there as well. But let me pivot to Iran for just a moment. Iran remains the world's worst sponsor of terrorism. It extends its malign influence both regionally and globally. The regime continues to exacerbate regional conflicts, both directly and through partners and proxies like the Lebanese Hezbollah and Hamas in Bahrain, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. Globally, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Quds Force, and the Ministry of Intelligence and Security remain Iran's primary tools to facilitate terrorist recruitment, financing, and plots across North and South America, Europe, and Asia. Senior al-Qaeda leaders continue to find refuge in Iran and benefit from the support provided to it by elements of Iran's government. I think a good example of that, and something that Secretary Pompeo disclosed that was not declassified, but not widely known, I guess, in January, and I'm not sure how widely known it still is, but an example of that would be the 9/11 attackers, as we're coming up on the anniversary of 9/11 here in a few months. Many of the attackers that were involved in 9/11 received training in Afghanistan. And even though our national security infrastructure wasn't the same as back before 9/11 as it is today, having these guys from Saudi Arabia or Egypt come through with stamps on their passports from Iran, which is what they used to enter Afghanistan, would have raised red flags, or at least the possibility, right? So, hindsight's 2020. But we have solid evidence that many of those folks transited through Iran and their passports were never stamped, and that was a sign of coordination and a form of support from the government of Iran that I think is very telling as we look at the long history of Iran's support for terrorism and terrorist organizations. Whether that's right now, if you look at Yemen, the terrorist or the organization that is causing a lot of heartache there, the Ansar Allah, which is associated with the Houthis. They just last week put out, pictures on social media about all of their new weapons and drones and ballistic missiles, and all of that's originating in Iran. And those weapons are being used against Saudi Arabia, not against Saudi Arabian military targets. They're being used against civilian airports. They're being used against oil fields and that sort of infrastructure, and exacerbating what is the world's worst humanitarian disaster, the famine that is currently ongoing in Yemen. So Iranian influence continues to be malign, continues to be a real challenge for the United States and our partners, and their support of terrorism as a means to an end to further their goals is clearly documented and is an ongoing concern. So let me pivot then back to racially or ethnically motivated terrorism, which is what we call sort of the right-wing groups that you might see out there, like Canada designated the Proud Boys. That's an American group, so our authority to designate terrorist organizations starts at the water's edge. The United States has designated one, what we would call a racially or ethnically motivated violent extremist organization, and that is the Russian Imperial Movement. They are located near St. Petersburg, and we're providing training to like-minded white nationalists, white supremacist sympathizers. They trained a couple of guys from Sweden that went on to conduct some bombings and kill people. They're convicted of that. Prosecutors specifically mentioned the training that they were provided by RIM as part of the indictment and part of the conviction. We continue to look for other networks out there that that meet the designation for or meet the basis for designation, but designating terrorist organizations is really only one tool we have in our toolbox in the United States, and so our part of this is to develop toolkits and tool sets that are agnostic as to ideology, right? And so if you're trying to prevent terrorists from traveling, it doesn't really matter if that person is affiliated with a white supremacist group in Europe or an Islamic Jihad based or Salafist group in Iraq. We still want to stop that person from getting on a plane. So that's one way that we approach that. Following the January 6th attack on the Capitol, the Biden administration directed United States government to conduct a review. They call it a 100-day sprint to better understand the threat that domestic violent extremists pose, assess what the United States government is currently doing in this area, and determine what more needs to be done. Now, on the State Department's staff, while the focus of this review is first and foremost on the domestic threat, we are focused more on the transnational linkages of these domestic violent extremists. There's often a perception that these actors are largely isolated within their respective countries, and to some extent that's true. But however, we have seen increasing evidence of connections between these sorts of groups in the United States and actors abroad. For instance, the group I mentioned, the Russian Imperial Movement, had sent people to the United States to meet with white nationalist affiliated groups here, had invited folks from the United States to attend their training camps in Russia, and there's other open source information out there about some of those links. Another example that's maybe a little bit less concrete but still alarming, the 2019 attack in El Paso, where the perpetrator was inspired by the Christchurch Attackers Manifesto. Christchurch attack was just 2 years ago. We noted that anniversary on Monday. You know, those sorts of the postings of manifestos, the sort of coordination that you see online used to be in the 8chan and other sort of open internet forums. Now I think has moved a lot to places like Telegram. Is a matter of continuing concern and makes it a transnational threat. 1 second, please. I'm good, thanks. Yep, thank you. Sorry about that. I should have put a sign on my door or something. Okay, and so I talked a little bit about lines of effort and about what we see as the threat landscape. And I think I take one moment just to note that how we do that, and oftentimes how we communicate and organize ourselves, is through national security strategies. The United States has developed 4 national security strategies since the 9/11 attacks. In 2002, focused almost entirely on Al-Qaeda, focused almost entirely on kinetic action, taking terrorists off the battlefield, or just off the field in general, even if it wasn't a battlefield, which is where you get into the kind of legalistic issues on the authorization for use of military force. There was another one produced in 2007 that was also focused on Al-Qaeda, and one in 2011 that started to broaden the scope on the terrorist threat that we were facing, but also relied pretty heavily on kinetic action. The last one was issued in 2018 under the Trump administration, and it was post-ISIS, and it was really focused more on that fluid threat picture that I had addressed up top. What we sought in that document and that strategy is to balance our efforts so that it's not just kinetic action. It's a realization that we have to address the instability and insecurity in areas that enable terrorists to flourish, and then some of the long-term drivers, that's countering violent extremism. So giving people alternatives, trying to undermine some of the terrorist ideology that they use to radicalize people to violence and to recruit people into their movements. That can be a tricky thing, right? Because in the United States, it's a joke when they say I'm from the government and I'm here to help, but that message falls even flatter when you show up in Mali and say that I'm from the United States government and I'm here to help. So how you deliver those messages and to how you kind of seek to recruit and to use international fora, non-governmental organizations, education, academics, all of those different sorts of avenues to establish programs to counter violent extremism, prevent violent extremism, I think is something that pays dividends on that long-term thing where people don't see resorting to political violence as the only solution to the issues and anger that they are experiencing in their lives. I have a thing in here about Navy SEALs saying that we can't kill our way out of the war on terror. When I worked at the Department of Homeland Security, it used to do a lot of work on drug trafficking interdiction on the border, and tracking down those networks and organizations. And that was another point that we used to say all the time. We're not going to be able to arrest our way out of drug trafficking and drug consumption issues in the United States. There has to be that balanced approach. And I think that same sort of model, that same sort of perspective applies to terrorism and the use of violence to achieve political means. We're good at killing people. We've sharpened that pretty well. We've been very successful in that arena, but it's not solving the problem long term. So we have to have that holistic approach that addresses the drivers of terrorism and that seeks to make us a security partner of choice, so that these governments feel comfortable and we bring the best kit, the best tools in the world. That this kind of gets implicated, and I won't touch on it here, in what people call great power. We here at the State Department prefer near peer competition, because Russia isn't a great power. It's kind of a near peer in some areas. Same would apply to China in our perspective. But so as we're operating and seeking to provide assistance to country in these spaces, you have to, we have to keep in mind that other countries are as well. But we offer the better deal, and we seek to be the security partner of choice to ensure that we're helping as they establish the rule of law. You can establish rule of law China's way and have a sort of a more oppressive approach, or you can model the United States, where you have respect for human rights and a commitment to democracy, to give people a voice, and to give societies the tools they need to organize themselves and to ensure their safety and security and eventual prosperity. So I'll stop there and just say that's a snapshot of the CT threat picture and the landscape, and happy to take any questions or any observations that you folks may have.
I have a question. You spoke of the causes for international terrorism. Do you see those as similar for domestic terrorism?
I would say that there are some similarities in ideology, and mostly a frustration that they are powerless in the face of whatever force the antagonist might be. Here in the United States, that may be, the government or the police, or corporations. I think I'm not an expert on domestic terrorism, but that frustration of lack of control over one's destiny, or that things aren't being done the way they should be, and that there's no way to affect that change short of political violence. I think that's a mindset that's probably common to terrorist groups, but certainly the Salafists who are seeking to kill Shias in Syria don't necessarily have that same sort of concern about government, but they do have that same concern about establishing their way of life and ensuring control over their communities. And they don't see a way to do that without overthrowing the government or
Thank you.
whatever organization is in control.
There's a question in the chat box from Jill in regard to our homegrown terrorists in the United States. How can we use education starting in elementary school to help reduce domestic terrorism? Now, this is coming from a person who teaches teachers. So,
okay. So we focused on resilience here at the State Department, and I wouldn't want to get into the Department of Homeland Security's lane on that. And frankly, it's easy to get crossways with First Amendment issues, right? It's okay to be a white supremacist in the United States. It's not okay to use a pipe bomb to try to implement your white supremacy. So there's kind of that distinction there that can get pretty tricky. What we do at the State Department is we have a number of programs, one of them being the Strong Cities Network, where we kind of try and connect mayors and other local leaders with others who have faced similar problems, similar challenges in their communities, to document best practices, lessons learned, and to help build resiliency. We hosted an event with the Dalai Lama at the end of January, and the mayor of Los Angeles and mayors from all over the world to talk about resilience. And so I don't know that I'm the person to address U.S. educational systems, but what we do overseas is to work with institutions and organizations that are committed to peaceful resolution of conflict. For instance, we work, I think it's fair to say, one of the drivers of Salafist terrorism. Terrorism kind of emanating from, not from Saudi Arabia, but sort of an ideology that had grown roots in Saudi Arabia, was addressing textbooks and how textbooks dealt with things like Jews, right? And so there was a lot of really harmful, hateful sort of material, and it's been an ongoing effort working through partners to help find a path forward to defang some of those more problematic things out in the world that can lead people to believe that the only solution is the death of the other.
No, and I understand it, because I do know there's you have to be careful. There's a fine line between, stomping on someone's First Amendment rights and, but I do like the teaching conflict resolution and things like that to help solve some of these issues. And if you can start that at a young age, I think that could make a difference.
Yeah, we also, I think we've really, at least I've seen recently, a lot of focus on recruiting mothers and women to help engage in countering violent extremism. And I think that's probably a good path forward as well. Speaking again, externally to the United States. When you can find people in the community, the problem is, right, with the United States, sometimes if someone is seen to be associated with us, that puts a target on their back. And so we have to be careful not to create a worse problem for someone by supporting them.
You mentioned that the counterterrorism from your purview starts at the water's edge, but you also mentioned that linkages to domestic terrorists by foreign actors can allow you to sort of monitor the domestic ones, right? Do they have to make the actual physical contact, or is internet monitoring of social media and internet and so forth part of the purview of the State Department's counterterrorism efforts?
It is not. We do not. When you use a word like monitor, to me that says intelligence community and law enforcement.
So that's FBI?
Yeah, that's not me. That's the FBI, and of course overseas the intelligence community. They don't collect on U.S. citizens domestically. But looking at those sort of linkages and weakening them is certainly a goal, because what we wouldn't want to see is that sort of a movement metastasize in Europe and in the United States. And so nothing's ever going to be comparable to, is ISIS the same, as a KKK or something like that? They're not, and there's going to always be differences. But have we seen things in the growth of terrorist ideologies and terrorist groups and other locations and other settings that can perhaps inform some of the things to look out for as we seek to examine those linkages between white supremacist organizations? I think, yeah, we'd be silly not to.
So would it be? I'm sorry, someone else was asking a question. Maybe.
No, that's okay. I was just going to go to the chat box. You're all right, Marcus.
I was just curious. This is kind of a follow up, and you talked about affecting the terrorist groups by limiting their access to their financial resources. So if there's a linkage to domestic terrorists directly through international terrorists, is there a way to then address that in terms of freezing their financial assets, or is that also not?
So that's kind of tricky, right? So the way we block access to financial assets and to financial resources is through the use of terrorist designations, whether that be a foreign terrorist organization designation or a specially designated global terrorist. Just a couple of the tools that the federal government has to name and shame and to introduce consequence for groups that are involved in violent activity. So, for instance, for RIM, for Russian Imperial Movement, those designations prevent members of RIM from traveling to the United States, but other nations follow our lead oftentimes on things like that and would prevent them from traveling in their territories as well. And then any property or interests they have in the United States would be blocked, meaning they wouldn't be able to access them. And then if they had a foreign terrorist organization designation, that opens you up to material support, which is where you see most of the Department of Justice and FBI investigations and convictions for people traveling to support ISIS or sending money. Those material support positions are based on the State Department's foreign terrorist organization. So to apply that in a domestic setting, right? We don't and can't designate American groups as terrorist organizations because our authority starts at the water's edge. So to the extent that if like RIM had a shared bank account with an organization in the United States, or there was an organization in the United States that was fundraising or involved in financial transactions, it may open them to consequence, but I'm not an attorney nor a prosecutor. And so I don't want to get out over my skis on something like that. But I would say in general, if the United States has considered a group to be a terrorist organization, a prudent person would not engage with them in any sort of meaningful way.
Stuart Shaw asks in the chat box, how does the internet or social media impact your fight against terrorism?
Yeah, I think in many ways, the internet has made things better and made things worse. And this is certainly terrorist use of the internet is an ongoing concern, and I think has really driven, ISIS. As you all saw from the bio, I'm a senior public affairs guy. I do public affairs work. That's messaging documents and making sure that we're explaining things and our products look good. We're doing videos. What do the tweets look like? That's like basic PR work, right? ISIS had, their PR, their videos were really focused and effective, and that I think is a product of modern technology, modern internet. I think encrypted communications these days really make it a challenge for law enforcement and the intelligence community to keep a complete awareness of what's going on out there when there are threats to the United States. Certainly in that area of recruitment, it's a real challenge. So what do we do here? In the United States, we work with companies on a voluntary basis for them to use their terms of service, right? So we flag stuff. We encourage others to flag. There are many groups out there that do that, so that when ISIS starts tweeting beheading videos or somebody starts plotting or talking about how their group is going to, foment civil war or something along those lines, that they're applying their terms of service and disabling, removing those accounts. That's what we do here, because we do believe the United States First Amendment, the only counter to bad speech is more speech, right? So we think messaging and that community resilience are really important. Other countries have different laws, and they're able to designate. Canada does this all the time, designates groups on the basis of their speech. That is not something that the United States seeks to do, and that would not really align with our values. So we have to find other ways to skin that cat, so to speak.
Prior to doing your current job, were you by any chance a high school band director?
No, I'm tone deaf. I would be horrible.
Well, I understood exactly every word you said this whole entire time.
Way to go, Al. There's a question in the chat box that I'm going to try to summarize two of them, I guess. Norm is asking if our adversaries, for instance, Russia, do they experience as much terrorism as we do? And I guess the previous question is what checks are in place to curtail political motivations, and I guess how do you decide who's a terrorist?
Sure. So first part of that question, you have to for what we would term notionally our adversaries, you'd have to rely on their reporting. I would note that the DHS and the FBI have been very successful in countering terrorist attacks. We haven't seen the number of terrorist attacks recently in the United States that we have historically. They've prevented a lot, and much credit to them. Russia does have a problem and admits to the problem. I don't have the stats at my fingertips, but people that have followed Russian news know that Chechen, Dagestan, they have a restive Muslim population that has engaged in some pretty horrific acts of terrorism, and I think that's something that they are continuing to deal with. Different system of government, and certainly different sort of understanding of what the rule of law is. China, I'm not sure to the same extent. I'm not sure what sort of reporting they do. I would say China uses what we would consider to be a pretext for counterterrorism. So the whole thing, you may have heard about the detention and mass detention of the Uyghurs, the camps that Russia or that China has, and the violations of human rights, and the concerns that everyone from the UN Secretary General to President Trump to President Biden has expressed as a real problem. And that is their treatment of the Uyghurs and in the detention camps and violating their rights. Well, China does that partially under the name of countering terrorism, because it is an ethnic Muslim population, and there are terrorist groups out there that have connections to the Uyghurs. So you take that and sort of suppress an entire ethnicity based on potential bad behavior. That would never happen in the United States, nor should it. But I don't know that we can say the same thing about China. So, as I said at the top, mostly, organized terrorist groups, organized terrorist organizations seek, the ones that are what we call like your ISIS, your Al Qaeda. They seek ungoverned spaces to establish themselves, and so that's where at least where I see the majority of attacks. In the United States, it's less so, and we don't have a domestic terrorism designation. There's no there is currently no mechanism for that, and it's an open question amongst lawmakers and policy people if one is even necessary, or if the tools that law enforcement already has at its disposal are sufficient to address that problem. And as to what makes a terrorist, the use of violence to effect a political end. That is what a terrorist does. A terrorist uses violence to effect a political end. So that's that's not a personal thing like a murder. That is not committing a crime like a robbery, although there are, obviously some associations between crime and terrorism. But it's the use of violence to affect a political end. That's how we look at it, at least outside of the United States. Community resilience starts with communities, and it's community organizations like the Rotary Club, like other civic organizations, like-minded citizens that help lower the temperature on conflict. That I think, we can sit here and blather away in Washington all day long, but it's really, the commitment of folks that want to keep their communities safe, that at the end of the day, whether it's terrorism or any other public safety challenge, that really make the difference. So thank you for your service and for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate you. Well, folks, this is coming up on a milestone. Next week is Remotery episode 52. So we've been doing this for a year online. We've literally brought the world to the Rotary Club of Jonesboro. We've had speakers from Australia. We've had speakers from Louisiana. We've had speakers from Washington, D.C., and it's been amazing. So I just wanted to express my thanks to everyone for making the commitment to the club to stay engaged and stay active. Thought for the day: life shrinks or expands in proportion to one's courage. So it is now 1 o'clock. Go forth and rotate.
Thank you. Good meeting.
Yes.